What you guys, got another video here for you on building a balanced PC. Now what we're going to do here is show you how to choose the best parts for you and also what fits your budget. So work out what your budget is and try to stick to a budget that suits your build. Otherwise what's going to happen is you're going to end up with, for instance, a 3080, a RTX 3080 and a i3 processor or a Ryzen 3 processor. You don't really want to do that because it will be unbalanced and you'd end up with bottlenecking and the CPU will be holding the GPU back. So what we're going to do is go through each component and show you how to basically choose the right parts for your particular build. So let's go ahead and take a look at the CPUs first. So for instance, if you was looking for a Ryzen 5 3400G, you can see here this has got 4 cores and 8 threads. Now we're going to go through some scenarios here for the reasons why you would not buy it. Now, if you're going to buy this CPU just because it has a GPU built into it and you don't want to buy a GPU, then by all means buy that CPU for that reason, because it is going to be beneficial to you, because that means you don't have to buy a GPU. And of course, we can't buy GPUs at the moment because of the climate we're in. But if you look at this GPU here that's built in here, it's pretty good for basic use. You can play some games on it and stuff like that. But if you're a real gamer and you want to get a better CPU, then you'd rather go for the Ryzen 5 3600 because it has 6 cores and 12 threads. You are going to get better frames per second with this CPU than you would be with that CPU if you put a GPU in there. So just bear that in mind when you're picking these particular types of CPUs. And they're roughly around about the same price. One has a GPU in it and one doesn't. And you'll get more frames with this one. And also with the Intel versions, it's the same thing. Basically what they do is they offer different versions. There's a 10400F version here, which means it doesn't have a GPU built into there, which means if you're not going to use it, then there's no point having it. And you can save some money by having them take the GPU out and just buying this version here, which is just pure CPU with 6 cores in it, which is what you want. And it's the same thing for the i7s. They also do an i7 10700KF, which is an unlocked version, which means you can overclock it, and you can also have the GPU removed out of it by having the F version there, which makes it still a very good overclocker, and it doesn't have the GPU. But they also do the K version with the GPU on it as well, depending on what your needs are. Okay. So another rule of thumb, really, what you're trying to do is if you're looking for, say, for instance, basic tasks, you don't need an i7 or anything like that. You can use a CPU that's of a cheaper grade, a lower end sort of level, about $100 or something like that. Gaming wise, you want to start looking for your Ryzen 5 3600 or the newer generations, depending on what you're going for. Around about the $200–300 range, and then you've got your media sort of work, which is your video editing and stuff like that. You want to go for Ryzen 7 and Ryzen 9s, and also you want to go for i7s and i9s as well if you're doing that type of work. But i5s are great for gaming as well. So if you're looking for just a gaming system, either the Ryzen 5 or the i5s are pretty good choices. Okay, so let's take a look at the power supply. Now, this is a real big problem for a lot of people because what they do is they end up buying a cheap power supply because they start running out of money. And they look for a cheap power supply online and they will see something with 700 watts on it like this. And they'll think that will do. It's got 700 watts, but there's more to it than that. So you need to make sure you know what you're doing when you're buying a power supply. So what should you look for when you're buying a power supply? One, the power is this here, but this is not just necessarily the power that you're going to get. It's to do with the label on the side of the power supply. You'll notice here they're not showing the label. And I've did a video on this particular power supply. It's absolute rubbish. And the thing is, you're not going to get that amount of power. It's probably going to be in the region of like 200 watts or something like that on the 12-volt rail, which is not going to be good, or something along them lines. So what should you look for? Well, you're looking for power for your GPU. So if your GPU recommends that you have a 500 watt power supply, then you should be looking to put that on the system at least, so don't have to underdo it, or you don't have to overdo it. So never underdo your power supplies. You know, I know people show videos where you don't need a high-end power supply to run games, and it runs at a lower wattage than what they recommend. But eventually what will happen is the power supply will start to get really hot and it will start to foul. And of course, if it doesn't have any protection in it, and they might say it's got a little bit of overvolting protection here and all this sort of nonsense, but I can guarantee you there's no certification on this power supply, and it will have probably no protection inside of it. And when it goes bang, it's going to take all your components and all your expensive components with it. So just bear that in mind. So you want to look for a brand. That's the next thing. So let's take a look at a decent power supply. So a decent power supply will be something like Seasonic or something like that, or you've got some other brands out there that don't actually make the power supplies. They just put their logo on the power supply itself, but you'll probably find it's other big companies like Seasonic and other companies like it that are making those power supplies for them. So you definitely want to look for a decent brand of power supply. Don't overdo the actual power supply. You don't need to go for 850 watt 80 plus gold if you don't need it. There's no point in overspending on something like this if you don't need it. So if you only need 500 watts, you can get a good, 550 watt, 600 watt power supply with a bit of headroom there, just to make sure you've got some breathing space, and comes down to 80 plus gold, bronze, silver, platinum. There's loads of different ones. The next thing you want to look for is whether you want full modular, semi-modular, or whether you want to have just one with a big wad of cables in there. And that's another thing that you need to look for as well. One more thing you might want to look for is if you're buying a more cheaper, unbranded type of power supply, you're going to end up with the lack of cables for what you're trying to do in that PC build. So look out for the power outputs here. You'll see one 24 pin, one 4 pin, 12 volt, one 6 pin, and so on. So you might run out of cables, and basically what's going to happen is you're going to have to start getting extensions and splitters, and it ain't going to work very well. So try to steer clear of those cheaper power supplies that don't have that. Okay, another thing you want to look out for before we move on is the size of the power supply. You can see this is quite a compact size. Always check the length of it, because once you start getting up into the larger size power supplies, they normally grow in length. And the thing is, if you're using a small MIDI tower case, it's not going to fit very well, and you're going to have trouble getting those cables in as well. Especially if it's not a modular power supply, you're going to end up with problems there, which is another common problem that people run into. Also, make sure, again, it's got plenty of protection on it to protect all your components. And that normally comes with having a much more better branded power supply. Let's move on to the next section. Okay, so let's talk about motherboards. So what sort of motherboard should you go for? Well, there's going to be a lot of things to look out for when you're buying a motherboard. Obviously, you need to make sure it's the correct generation for your CPU. So it's going to accept your memory in your CPU. So you're going to make sure it's the right model. The next thing you need to do is DIMM slots. How many DIMM slots do you actually need? So you can see this one only has 2, but if you need 4, then you might want to buy one with 4 in it, especially if you want to upgrade. So that's another thing to look out for. Also, another area you want to look for is features. What sort of features do you need for your build? Do you need an NVMe slot on there, or M.2 slot on the board? How many graphics cards are you going to have? If you're only having one, you don't need loads of graphics cards expansion slots on there. Again, budget boards are pretty much that. They are very budget. So if you're looking for just a low-end gaming system and you're not overclocking or you're not doing anything like that, just make sure you can buy a cheaper motherboard. You don't need to go super high-end. On the other hand, there is restrictions with the megahertz here for the memory, because obviously it's a cheaper board. So bear that in mind when you're buying a cheaper motherboard. Make sure it supports all of the generations of processors that you're going for here. Intel's going to be different as well. Also, another thing to look out for your motherboard is the actual form factor. What size is it? I see so many PC builds where people buy a massive big case and a little tiny motherboard in there, and it looks lost and it's just looks ridiculous. So I try to buy it if the case is an ATX case and it will support an ATX motherboard, I'll try and buy an ATX board to fit in that case, so it fits right away down to the bottom, so it looks real nice and real plush. If you start buying a MIDI tower case and you're buying a micro ATX board, but it does accept an ATX motherboard in there, there's going to be a big gap down the bottom and it might not look so nice. So just bear that in mind when you're going for it. So your form factor's got to be correct there. Do you need RGB, overclocking capabilities or anything like that? If you don't and you just want to play games, you can use a cheap motherboard. You don't need anything fancy. But if you're looking for multimedia and some features like USB ports and stuff like that, then you will need to go up the food chain a little bit when it comes to buying your motherboard. Again, don't overbuy. So for instance, this is a really expensive motherboard. If you're just playing games and you're not really sort of going to do anything other than just playing games, then spending $340 on a motherboard is a bit overkill. So don't overdo things. Now, if you're looking to overclock, then that again comes back to what CPU you're using. So if you're using that CPU Ryzen 5 3400G, it's not an overclocking CPU. You're not going to get much overclock out of it. So you're going to waste your money on buying an expensive board with that chip because it doesn't pair together very well. And remember what I said to you about buying the right components that are similar specs for each other. That way they work better together. So you're just wasting money when you're buying something like this if you're not going to use all the features. Okay, so let's move on to RAM here. Now RAM, there is tons of different RAM modules out there to buy, and just make sure before you start buying your RAM that you've got the right type of RAM for your system, whether it be DDR3, DDR4, whether you want fancy RAM with heat spreaders on them to cool it down like these ones, or whether you just want the generic type of RAM, which is just like green with the chips exposed on the side. That's budget RAM or value RAM. So depending on what you're trying to do here will determine on what you're trying to buy. Do you want RGB or do you want just standard RAM like this with no RGB? So work out that whether you want any sort of those types of features on your RAM. Now the next thing we're going to be taking a look at is the speed of the RAM. So you can see here this speed of RAM is 3600 megahertz. And again, this is just going to come down to what you're trying to do. Ryzen does like super fast memory. So if you're looking to buy RAM, then you really want to sort of get the better, faster RAM as possible. Depending on what type of Ryzen processor you've got. If you've got the first gen, you're not going to need this 3600 speed because the motherboard's going to restrict you from running that speed. Remember the motherboard we was looking at earlier, this one here. Remember, this one only goes up to 3200 megahertz overclock. So you're not going to utilize that 3600 speed in that motherboard. So just bear that in mind when you're buying budget boards with memory. You don't really want to spend that much money on that memory because you're not going to be able to utilize it. So what you're looking for really is the speed of RAM for that board, and make sure they just work together. Remember that saying what we said earlier on, they're just similar in what you're trying to do. So make sure you're buying the similar items to work together, and that's what you're trying to do here. It's so tempting to see a cheap deal on and you buy it, and yes, it will step down. It will normally step down and you're only going to get the speeds that you're trying to get. Another thing to look out for when it comes to RAM is the amount of RAM that you need. How much RAM do you need? Well, you can see here 216 gig sticks is for 32 gigabytes in size. You don't need 32 gigabytes of RAM to play games. If you're starting out for maybe a budget system, bare minimum you want to get is 8 gigabytes. And definitely try to get those in dual channel, which is 2 4 gig sticks, which will give you dual channel at 8 gigabytes in speed. Preferably, you do want to start looking at trying to get 16 gigabytes, and that's much more probably today in 2021 is probably where we're heading, I would say, as the bare sort of minimum for what you should be looking at getting. Now, if you're looking at multimedia and things like that, video editing, I would say 32 gigabytes is a good starting point, and then you can look and see how your system reacts when you're working with those types of files. Next up, you're looking for the time is the CL18. You can see here what you're looking for is timings between CL12 and CL6, in that sort of ballpark. If you want to go larger RAM with lower latency, then you will have to pay a lot more money. And this is when the memory speeds and timings will go up and the price goes up with it. So just bear that in mind, okay? So when you're looking here, you see the price here for these two at 16 gigabytes, and that's two 8 gig sticks, 3000 megahertz at $77. That will be ideal for that cheap budget board. You could literally drop that in and it will work a charm. Obviously, if you want RGB and stuff, you will have to start to look for RGB memory as well. So that's the other thing we're talking about, single channel and multi-channel. Don't fall into the trap of just buying one stick of 8 gigs of RAM and think I'll upgrade later on, because you're going to only run in single channel. A lot of pre-built systems use that method, and it can hinder the system performance quite a lot by just having single channel and dual channel. So make sure you buy 2 sticks of RAM and put them in dual channel mode. Also, what we're looking for here is the brand of RAM. That's another thing that you want to look out for. This is T-Force. You're going to get a lot of Chinese brands on the market which you might not know about, and they might not be compatible, which moves on to the compatibility of that RAM with that motherboard. If it's not on the compatibility list, which you should check on the manufacturer's website of that motherboard, you're going to run into problems, XMP problems, maybe timings are not going to be able to sit right with that motherboard. You may have to wait for a BIOS update for them to release so it works well with that board. They may not release it, and it just might not be compatible. So always check. Now, also what I try to do is buy branded RAM from a reputable company, so I know that it's going to support XMP, which is what you can see down here, and it's going to support the motherboard manufacturer that I'm buying it for. I always check their compatibility list to make sure that it works well with that board. Some of these unknown brands, you might find that these features are not going to work properly, and XMP might not work, or you might have problems with timings and other issues like that. So make sure you check the compatibility list for that memory. Another thing, that's the RAM that we've covered here. Okay, so let's move on to graphics cards here. So how are you going to choose your graphics card? Well, it just depends on your budget. Graphics cards are really expensive, but I see people still making loads and loads of mistakes when it comes to buying graphics cards. So let's go through the whole GPU experience and find out what one is right for you. So first off, start with the price. How much can you really afford for a graphics card? What people tend to do is they'll go and buy the graphics card first because they're a gamer, buy a really high-end graphics card, and then they cheap out on computer components for that graphics card because they've got no money left, and they end up with an unbalanced system. So buy within your price range with the other components that you're buying, or you can always upgrade to a good GPU a little bit later on. Just remember that. So let's talk about the power connections here first. So on a graphics card, you'll get power connections on the card. You can see here, this one doesn't have or require any sort of power, additional power added to the card. So that means you can just plug it straight in to the into the motherboard and basically put in your HDMI or DP cable and it will work. Some graphics cards require power, and you will need to put in the actual power connectors to the card to power the card itself. This is where we're getting back to the power supply, what power supply you choose, and the ratings that you choose to suit your graphics card. Some will have an 8-pin or a 6-pin connector, and you need to make sure that you're getting the right type of card and the right type of power supply for that card. You can see down here recommended 300 watts. So make sure you're buying the right type of power supply for this graphics card that you're using. Now, of course, what you don't want to be doing is going to buy a really high-end graphics card and sticking that into a really budget system, because it's just going to bottleneck the whole thing. And if you're using cheap power supplies, you're running the risk of this blowing up and causing major problems for yourself. So don't do that. And if you look here on this card, you can see that it's got two 8-pin connectors on it. So that's going to take a pretty beefy power supply to run that card. It's going to need two 8-pin connectors. And if you're buying a cheap power supply, it's just not going to go with it. So remember, this is for video streaming of 8K and high performance 4K gaming. So you don't need to do this type of card in your build unless you're going to utilize it. There's no point. You're just wasting your money. And that's why choosing a graphics card for the monitor that you're using is so important. So for instance, if you've got a 1080p monitor and you're playing 1080p games, then there's no point having a graphics card of this caliber. You're just wasting your money and you're not going to get the performance from it. Especially if it's a 60 hertz monitor, 1080p, which I see quite a bit, and people are using a really high-end GPU. A 1660 Super will be perfectly fine, and you will get all of the performance out of that card all day long, and you've not spent a fortune on a GPU just to play games. So just bear that in mind when you're coming to choose a graphics card. It's going to come down to the sort of budget that you've got for your build. So there's no good buying a 3070 if you're running 1080p. You're wasting your money because you're not going to utilize it. Just get yourself a lower end graphics card, maybe a 3060 or something like that, and you should be okay. Anyway, let's move on to the next section. Let's talk about PC cases. So we're looking at PC cases here. You can see this one's an £169.99 case. It's a pretty high-end case. It's a nice case, but for a budget, you might like that case so much that you want it, and then you go and put the cheap components inside, and it just looks real horrible, and you wonder why it doesn't look very nice. And that's because you're buying a really high-end case, and then you put in a £30 motherboard in there that just looks absolutely ridiculous. So just bear in mind what you're trying to do. If you're really going up the food chain like this, then you want to put all the other components with it. So how would you go about choosing a case? Well, there's quite a few things you need to look at. The aesthetics, obviously, the look of it, what you want. Cooling and fans and airflow. How many fans are you going to get in that build? Do you have to buy the fans? That's another thing. And how good is it at cooling? Cable management capabilities. Does it have good cable management? That's another thing that you want to look at. Drive bays and SSD mounting points. How many does it have? How much do you need out of it to put in there? So for instance, if you've got 4 drives that you want to put in, can it take 4 3.5 inch drives? All those things just take into account. Glass panel, obviously, do you want glass on the side or not? RGB, is that a thing for you? Do you need RGB? If not, then don't go for an RGB type case or fans. Form factor, what sort of size of motherboard you're going to put in there. You'll see down here that it says mini ITX. You're not going to put a mini ITX motherboard in that case. It's going to look ridiculous. Micro ATX, I still wouldn't put a micro ATX in there. I would put an ATX in there because it will look much nicer. So again, if you want to get a micro ATX board because you're on a budget, then buy a micro ATX case and it will fit in there and look lovely, and it should fit a lot better. Just bear that in mind. So just buy the right case for the right type of build that you're doing. You should be fine. Again, next thing you want to look at is the front panel connectors. What sort of front panel connectors does it have on here? You can check all those out and make sure it's got all of the type of needs that you want and features that you want for your build. And you can see cable management. It's got plenty of upgradability in here for storage and loads of other good stuff like that. So just check all those things out. Sound dampening, if you want a quiet type of case, then look to see how the sound dampening is on that case. Also dust filters. Do you need dust filters on your build? Radiator support. Maybe you want to put a radiator in there. Does it support the size of radiator that you want to use for your build? And also power supply basement. Does it have one of those, and do you need it down here? That's that area that hides your power supply. Does it need a window? Do you don't want a window on it? You need to look at all those things when you're buying your case. Now, if you're on a budget, you can buy cheaper cases that look absolutely lovely as well. Cases like the Dark Flash and other types of cases which cost half the money that costs, and it will still be within your budget, and it will still look very nice when you build it. And you can see here, this is micro ATX, which supports micro ATX motherboards. So you can buy a micro ATX motherboard and it will fit straight in there, and fit all the way down to the bottom. If it does say supports ATX like this, then bear in mind if you're buying a micro ATX motherboard, it will have that gap at the bottom. Just bear that in mind. Okay, so moving on to storage. This is another one that you're going to have to work out for yourself. How much storage do you need? I see so many times people buying small storage like this, 120 gigabytes. After they install Windows and put all their stuff on it, they find out they're running out of space already, and then their drive's running in the red. So really don't do that. Try to make sure that you give yourself enough space for a bit of data. I tend to go on the rule of thumb nowadays where I try to get a terabyte, and I know some people can't afford a terabyte drive when it comes to an NVMe drive, but that's what I go for. There's the sort of middle of the road Gen 3 type of drives here, NVMe, very fast speeds, as you can see, 2,400 megabytes per second here on these ones. They do Gen 4s as well, which are even faster, but again, this is probably where I'd sort of go for now. Get a terabyte of these in. That will give you plenty of storage in here for your Windows and other bits and pieces like your applications and stuff, and give you a bit of breathing room. You can always put a mechanical drive in there for storage if you want to, or buy a cheaper SSD for storage if that's what you want to do as well. So just make sure that you're trying to give yourself the best performance. Now, obviously, do you need this NVMe drive for a cheap budget board like this one? And the simple answer to that is probably not. You don't need to go down that route, but it does support NVMe, as you can see here. So it just depends on what you're trying to get. You can put an NVMe in here, but if you're on a super tight budget, you might not be able to do it, and you might need to go for an SSD or something like that and leave that as an option for upgrade later on down the line. But if you're trying to just play games, then having a cheap SSD is also doable, but just make sure you get the right sort of size. But they do a 500 gigabyte NVMe drive Gen 3 version, and it's only $50 or something like that. You can see here $55, which isn't bad. So I tend to go for these rather than the cheaper SSDs, in my personal opinion, because the speed difference is quite a lot, and you can visibly see it when transferring data around your computer. Okay, so let's talk about CPU coolers next, and what do you need? Well, you can use the stock cooler that comes with the Ryzen or the Intel processor. You don't really need to use any other type of cooler. If you're just playing games, it will be fine. But if you look for, say, for instance, a cooler that looks nice, maybe it's got RGB on it, or maybe you just want something that's a bit cooler that cools the CPU down a lot more, then you can choose an aftermarket cooler, something like this. These are pretty cheap and affordable, around about 30 odd pounds, and you can get yourself a decent cooler. Just bear in mind what the size is and how big you want to go. I mean, do you really need to have a massive cooler? If it's just a cheap motherboard, probably not. I would use just a stock cooler. But if you want to get overclocking and things like that, again, it comes down to what type of board you've got, because obviously you need a good motherboard and a good power supply and everything else if you're overclocking, and a good CPU that overclocks as well, an unlocked CPU that is. So when it comes to these aftermarket coolers, you really don't need to go down that route unless you want something a bit nicer to look at, maybe RGB and something like this. You do get massive coolers like these, which do take up a lot of space in the case, and they do keep the CPU cool, but this with that budget motherboard would just be completely out of place, and it will be absolutely ridiculous. So again, taking into account the moldings around the, the heat sinks around the actual motherboard, is it going to fit in there? These are the things you have to take into account as well. And does it fit inside the case? These are the things that you have to look out for. The size of the GPU and the size of the CPU cooler. Will it all fit inside that case? That's the most important part when you're choosing these parts, especially these larger components like these. Now, again, you can choose whether you want to go down the closed loop water cooled system or whether you just want to go with an air cooler. It's entirely up to you what you choose to do, but just make sure your case supports these particular types of coolers if you're going down that route. Okay. Anyway, I think that's about it. It's a pretty long video, but I wanted to cover all of the main topics for all of the components that you've got in a build. So give you all of the information so you know exactly what to look out for when you're picking your parts for your next build. Anyway, I hope this one helps you out. It's been a bit of a long one, but I just wanted to make sure, try to cover every single base possible when it comes to choosing components. There is so much more that you can go over, but I think I've covered all the main points when it comes to choosing the right components to get a balanced PC for your next build. My name has been Brian from briteccomputers.co.uk. Just want to say a big shout out to all my YouTube members who have joined my YouTube members group. I really do appreciate the support, and I shall see you again for another video real soon. Bye for now.